The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
That very day, the first day of the week, 2 of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus. And they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looking downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word, before God and all the people. How our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. We were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women described, but him they did not see." And Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are! How slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And it happened that while he was with them at table, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. With that, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. But he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Such a familiar story, and yet it continues to reveal new insights, new graces. This year, beginning with the Easter Vigil, I concentrated on the passage of time. The Easter Vigil begins with the creation story. 6 days of creation. The 6th day of creation being the culmination in the creation of humankind, the pinnacle of God's creation. And then, the seventh day, God rested. And the Jewish tradition did not see God's rest as being inactive, but rather saw God's rest as being that of now going from the work of creation to the work of sustaining and renewing, and therefore restoring and healing. Which is why Jesus tried so very hard to deliberately do his works of healing on the Sabbath, to show that he was doing the work of God, the Sabbath work of God that sustains, restores, and heals, that brings us back to what God intended for us. That is the work of the seventh day, the day of rest. And then, the first day of the week is also the eighth day. And that is the day. The eighth day is the one that never ends. The eighth day is the day of the new covenant. The eighth day is the day of that new beginning signaled in the resurrection of Jesus in a different way, but still obviously one of us who has now achieved the fulfillment of what God has in store for us. That's the gift of the resurrection that will never end. And then the thing that struck me in this reading was it was evening of that day. And the disciples on their way to Emmaus were prevented from recognizing him. Notice it doesn't say they didn't recognize him. It's a little bit more subtle than that. They were prevented from recognizing him. So what might have prevented them? Well, if you're not looking for something, you're not going to find it. What prevented them was probably their own experience, their own ideas, their own looking back rather than looking forward. And so, obviously, Jesus would be the last person they would expect to encounter. That was simply impossible. And they did not recognize him in his teaching. He did not recognize him even when he, sort of repeated the same lessons he had been giving them before. This is the fulfillment. I am the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. They still, no, that wasn't quite squaring with their concept. So, it is only in the evening, in the breaking of bread, that their eyes were opened. What was removed from their eyes was the scale of their expectations. That suddenly, no, there is something new happening here. And the words, the instruction, did not touch us, even though it made our hearts burn. It did not touch us in the way that this gesture, repeated from what he had done 3 days earlier, changed their expectations. Therefore, they were able to see him. And with that, it's interesting. The word used is vanished from their sight. In other words, they no longer saw him physically. It doesn't say he disappeared, but he vanished from their sight, which implies that he was still there, but not earthly visible. And so, of course, they had to go back and share. And you notice it was late, it was evening, but there is never any indication that that day ends. And what they're greeted with, of course, is the experience of the other apostles, definitely as a result of the super apostle, Mary Magdalene, having announced the good news to them. And then it just began to make sense that now we are standing at the threshold of that day in which the Eucharist will be our nourishment, and that will never end, because what seems to be earthly end is truly fulfillment, and God's whole creation in and through us will come to completion and perfection.